It was a cold evening, the kind that made people walk a little faster, hands buried deep in their pockets, eager to get home. The city buzzed with life, car horns blaring, neon signs flickering, hurried footsteps against the pavement. In the middle of it all, a man named Daniel walked briskly through the streets, his mind weighed down by the pressures of another exhausting day. Daniel was an ordinary man, hardworking, responsible, but lately, life had been unkind. His job as a mechanic barely covered his rent, and no matter how many extra shifts he took, it felt like he was running in circles. His dreams of starting his own auto repair shop seemed more distant than ever. As he walked past a small park, something caught his eye. A frail old woman sitting alone on a bench, her shoulders trembling. The dim streetlight cast a glow over her hunched frame, and even in the low light, he could see her wiping her eyes. People passed her by without a second glance. Some stole a quick look before continuing on their way, unwilling to get involved. It was easier to pretend not to see. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't in the mood to deal with someone else's problems. His own troubles were already overwhelming. But as he took another step forward, something in his chest tightened. What if she needed help? What if she was lost? What if something terrible had happened to her? Taking a deep breath, he turned back. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked gently. The woman looked up, her eyes red and filled with sorrow. She seemed surprised that someone had stopped for her. For a moment, she said nothing, just staring at him as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Daniel crouched beside the bench, softening his tone. "I don't mean to intrude, but it's getting late, and it's cold out here. Do you need help?" A tear slipped down her wrinkled cheek. I don't know where to go," she whispered. Daniel frowned. Something about her voice, her sadness, told him that this was more than just a lost old lady on the street. And though he didn't know it yet, stopping to help her would change his life forever. Daniel sat down on the bench beside the elderly woman, keeping a respectful distance. She clutched a small, tattered handbag to her chest as if it held something precious. Her fingers trembled as she wiped her face with a handkerchief that looked as worn as she did. "I'm Daniel," he said gently. "Can I call someone for you? A family member?" She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "There's no one to call." Her voice carried a deep sadness, one that made Daniel's heart ache. He had seen loneliness before, but there was something different about this woman, something heavier. "What happened?" he asked, trying not to sound intrusive. For a moment, she didn't answer. She simply stared at the pavement, lost in thought. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I lost my home today." Daniel's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" She sighed deeply, her frail body shuddering from the cold. "I had a place, a small apartment I lived in for years. But it's gone now. I have nowhere to go." Her words hit Daniel harder than he expected. He knew what it was like to struggle, to feel as though the world was closing in on you. He had nearly been evicted himself a few months ago when work had been slow. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. "But don't you have anyone? Friends? Family?" She shook her head again. "Not anymore." Silence hung between them. The distant hum of the city felt almost intrusive in the quiet moment they shared. Daniel didn't know what to say. He wasn't in a position to help her. He barely had enough for himself. But he couldn't just walk away, not now. "I can get you something warm to eat," he offered. "There's a diner just down the street." The woman hesitated. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Daniel assured her. "Come on, it's just a meal." After a moment, she nodded. "All right, thank you." He helped her to her feet. She was lighter than he expected, almost too fragile, like a gust of wind could knock her over. As they walked toward the diner, Daniel noticed how people barely looked at them. It was as if the old woman had become invisible to the world. When they reached the diner, the warmth inside was a welcome relief from the biting cold. The smell of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air. A waitress greeted them with a tired but friendly smile, leading them to a small booth by the window. Daniel ordered 2 bowls of soup and some hot tea. The woman sat quietly, her hands resting on the table as if she wasn't sure she belonged there. "You never told me your name," Daniel said after a while. She glanced at him, as if debating whether to answer. Then, Finally, she said, "Margaret. My name is Margaret." "It's nice to meet you, Margaret," Daniel said with a small smile. Margaret stared out the window, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "You're a kind man, Daniel," she said after a moment. "Not many people would stop for someone like me." Daniel shrugged. "I don't think kindness should be rare." Margaret smiled, though sadness still lingered in her eyes. "I used to believe that too." Daniel could tell there was more to her story, something she wasn't saying. But he didn't press. He had a feeling that whatever she had been through had left wounds too deep to heal overnight. As they ate, Margaret's hands stopped trembling. The warmth of the soup seemed to bring some life back into her. Daniel didn't know what would happen after this meal. He didn't have a solution for Margaret's situation, but at least for tonight, she wasn't alone. And neither was he. The diner's warmth made Margaret look a little less fragile. She sipped her tea slowly, her fingers wrapped around the cup as if drawing comfort from its heat. Daniel watched her, noticing how her tired eyes darted around the room, as if she wasn't used to sitting in a place like this anymore. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked carefully. Margaret sighed, staring into her tea as if it held the answers to all her problems. "A few months," she admitted. "At first, I managed. I sold a few things, stretched what little I had. But rents go up, bills pile up, and soon," she trailed off, shaking her head. Soon, there was nothing left. Daniel could relate to that. The feeling of struggling to stay afloat while life kept pulling you under. "Did your landlord kick you out?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "I tried to talk to him, to get more time, but he didn't care. Said he couldn't afford to let me stay for free. I understand. He has to make a living too. But now I have nowhere to go." Daniel's jaw clenched. He had seen this happen before. People being discarded like old furniture when they could no longer afford a roof over their heads. It wasn't right. "Did you go to a shelter?" he asked. Margaret looked down at her hands. "I did, but they're full." "They always are." Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He felt frustrated on her behalf. The system wasn't built to catch people like Margaret, and without family or friends to rely on, she had simply slipped through the cracks. Margaret gave him a small, tired smile. "You don't need to worry about me, dear. I've gotten used to it." But that was the problem. No one should have to get used to being homeless. He hesitated before speaking again. I don't have much, Margaret, but I can get you a room for the night. Just one night, at least." Her eyes widened. "Oh, no, Daniel. I couldn't ask you to do that." "You're not asking," he said firmly. "I'm offering." Margaret looked at him for a long time, as if trying to gauge whether he was serious. Then, finally, she nodded, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "All right," she whispered. "Thank you." Daniel paid for the meal, then led Margaret outside. The night air was colder now, and he noticed how she pulled her coat tighter around herself. There was a cheap motel a few blocks away. It wasn't much, but it was clean and safe. When they arrived, the receptionist barely looked up as Daniel handed over the cash for a single night's stay. Margaret turned to him at the door of the room. "You're a good man, Daniel," she said softly. He shrugged. "Just doing what I hoped someone would do for me." She reached out and squeezed his hand. Her grip was weak, but the warmth in it was strong. "The world needs more people like you," she murmured before stepping inside. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching the door close. He didn't know why helping Margaret felt so different from helping anyone else. Maybe because, in some way, he saw himself in her. The fear of losing everything, the helplessness of not knowing what came next. With a sigh, he turned and walked away, never expecting that this small act of kindness would lead to something much bigger than he could ever imagine. The next morning, Daniel woke up feeling oddly lighter. It wasn't often that he felt like he had done something meaningful, but helping Margaret had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. As he made his way to work, he stopped by the motel, hoping to check on her. He wasn't sure if she'd still be there. Sometimes people disappeared overnight, choosing to slip away rather than accept help. But when he knocked on the door, it opened almost immediately. Margaret stood there, looking different than she had the night before. Though still frail, there was a warmth in her expression that hadn't been there before. She smiled softly. "I was hoping you'd come by," she said. Daniel returned the smile. I just wanted to check on you. Margaret nodded and stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. The small motel room was modest, but it was tidy. The bed was neatly made, and a steaming cup of tea sat on the nightstand. I don't know how to thank you, she said, sitting down carefully on the edge of the bed. Last night was the first time I slept in a real bed in months. I forgot what that felt like. Daniel leaned against the wall, shoving his hands into his pockets. I just wish I could do more. Margaret studied him for a moment before speaking. You've already done more than most. There was a moment of silence before she reached into her small, tattered handbag. I want you to have something, she said. Daniel frowned as she pulled out a small, rusted key and held it out to him. He hesitated. Margaret, what is this? She placed the key in his palm, curling his fingers around it. This is something very important. Daniel turned the key over in his hand. It was old, slightly worn, but still sturdy. Where does it go? Margaret let out a small sigh, staring at the key as if it carried the weight of a lifetime. It's the key to something I lost a long time ago, she said quietly. Daniel furrowed his brows. I don't understand. She smiled faintly. It'll all make sense soon. But first, I need to take you somewhere. They walked for almost half an hour, Margaret moving at a slow but determined pace. Daniel didn't push for more answers. He figured she'd tell him when she was ready. Finally, they reached their destination. A tall, abandoned building stood before them, its once grand exterior now covered in vines and years of neglect. The windows were boarded up, and the iron gate at the entrance was rusted but still intact. Margaret stopped in front of the gate, staring up at the building with a mixture of sorrow and nostalgia. This used to be mine, she said softly. Daniel turned to her, shocked. This was your place? She nodded. A long time ago, this building belonged to my family. It was a shelter, a place for people who had nowhere else to go. Daniel's heart clenched. A homeless shelter? Yes, she whispered. I ran it for years after my husband passed. It was my life's work. But when the funding ran out, and I could no longer afford the upkeep, I lost everything. The city shut it down, and before I knew it, I was on the streets myself. Daniel looked at the key in his hand, realization dawning on him. This key, he murmured. Margaret nodded. It's the key to the front door. The last thing I held on to from this place. Daniel stared at the crumbling building. It was clear it had been abandoned for years, but beneath the decay, he could still see the remnants of something beautiful. Margaret placed a hand on his arm. I don't have the strength to bring it back, she admitted. But you're young. You care. Daniel swallowed, looking back at her. Margaret, I don't know anything about running a shelter. She smiled. You didn't know anything about helping an old woman last night, either. But you did. Her words settled deep within him. For a long time, Daniel had been stuck in survival mode, barely making ends meet. But now, standing in front of this forgotten place, holding the key in his hand, something stirred inside him. Could he really do this? Could he take something broken and turn it into something meaningful? Margaret's eyes were filled with hope, but she didn't push. Just think about it, she said gently. Daniel exhaled slowly. He didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a choice. And that was a start. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the shelter. Even after he dropped Margaret back at the motel and went to work, his mind kept drifting back to the abandoned building. The key burned in his pocket, a constant reminder that he had been given something far greater than a simple object. It was an opportunity. But could he really do it? The thought of trying to rebuild something so broken felt overwhelming. He had never run anything in his life, let alone a shelter. He could barely keep himself afloat. Yet, as he walked home that night, he passed by a group of homeless people huddled under a bridge. He saw the way they clung to thin blankets, shivering against the cold. He thought about Margaret, about how easily someone's life could spiral into nothingness. And suddenly, the idea of doing nothing felt far worse than the fear of trying. The next morning, Daniel went back to the abandoned shelter. The iron gate creaked loudly as he pushed it open, stepping onto the overgrown path leading to the front doors. He took a deep breath and inserted the key. It turned with a satisfying click. Pushing the door open, he was hit with the scent of dust and time. The inside was just as run down as the outside. Broken furniture, shattered windows, peeling paint. But as he stepped through the empty halls, he could almost hear echoes of the past. Laughter, conversations, hope. Margaret had once built something incredible here. And maybe, just maybe, he could bring it back. Over the next few days, Daniel threw himself into research. He had no idea where to start, but he figured the first step was understanding what it would take. He visited libraries, searched online, and even reached out to a few local shelters to learn how they operated. It didn't take long for reality to sink in. The costs were overwhelming. Permits, renovations, supplies. He needed funding, and he had none. But that didn't stop him. Daniel started small. With whatever spare time he had after work, he cleaned up the building. He swept floors, boarded up broken windows, and removed debris. It was exhausting, but with every piece of trash he threw out, he felt something shift inside him. It was no longer just an idea. It was becoming real. Margaret visited often, offering advice and encouragement. Despite her frail condition, she insisted on helping, even if it was just sitting on an old chair and telling Daniel stories about the people she once helped. They weren't just strangers, she told him one evening. They were people. People who just needed someone to believe in them. Daniel nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. I want to do this, Margaret, but I don't know how to get people to care. Margaret smiled knowingly. You got me to care, she said. That's a start. As days turned into weeks, Daniel's determination grew. He started sharing his progress online, posting pictures of the shelter and telling Margaret's story. He didn't expect much, but to his surprise, people started paying attention. A few small donations trickled in, then a few more. Soon, a local news outlet picked up the story. They interviewed Daniel and Margaret, sharing their journey with a wider audience. And that's when everything changed. One evening, as Daniel was locking up for the night, his phone buzzed. He answered, and the voice on the other end nearly made him drop the phone. Mr. Carter, my name is Richard Ellison. I run a foundation that funds community projects like yours. I saw your story, and I think we can help. Daniel's heart pounded. You want to help fund the shelter? Yes, Richard said. I believe in what you're doing. Let's set up a meeting. As Daniel hung up, he turned to Margaret, his hands shaking. We did it, he whispered. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. No, Daniel, she said. You did it. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something he had long forgotten. Hope. The meeting with Richard Ellison's foundation was nerve-wracking. Daniel sat across from a panel of executives in a sleek office building, his hands clenched under the table. Margaret, too weak to travel, had insisted he go alone. He wished she was here. Her presence would have calmed him. He took a deep breath and spoke from the heart. He told them about Margaret's dream, about the people who once found refuge in the shelter. He told them about his own struggles, about the moment he realized how close he had come to being in their shoes. This place isn't just a building, he said. It's a second chance. It's hope. Silence filled the room after he finished. Then, Richard smiled. We're in, he said. Daniel's breath caught. You are. Richard nodded. Not only will we fund the renovations, but we'll also help with staffing and operations. You've proven this isn't just a passion project, you're committed. That's the kind of leadership we want to support. Daniel could barely believe it. A month ago, he was just another struggling worker. Now, he was about to reopen a shelter that could change countless lives. As he left the meeting, he immediately called Margaret. We did it, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret laughed softly. I always knew you would. Renovations began almost immediately. With the foundation's funding, construction crews repaired the shelter, installing new plumbing, replacing windows, and painting over the faded walls. Volunteers showed up, inspired by the story, ready to help in any way they could. Margaret, despite her failing health, insisted on visiting every few days. She sat in a chair outside, watching as her dream was restored. And then, just a few weeks before the grand reopening, she didn't show up. Daniel rushed to the motel, only to find her bed empty. The front desk clerk handed him a letter. With trembling hands, he opened it. Daniel, my time is coming to an end. But knowing you're here to carry on this work gives me peace. The shelter was never just mine. It belongs to those who believe in kindness. And no one believes in kindness more than you. I am proud of you. Always. With love, Margaret. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, silent tears rolling down his face. She was gone, but her legacy would live on. The night of the reopening, Daniel stood outside the shelter, watching as people gathered. The sign above the door read. The doors opened, and one by one, people stepped inside. Some homeless, some volunteers, all carrying hope in their hearts. As Daniel looked around, he felt a presence beside him. Margaret wasn't here in person, but she was here in spirit. He closed his eyes and whispered, "We did it, Margaret." And for the first time in his life, he knew he had found his purpose.